Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs, and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Vara Reom, and I am a recent graduate of the University of Colorado and the student program chair of CWA. And for recording purposes, today is Tuesday, April 8th, 2025. It is 3:30 p.m., and this is panel number 18145, titled America First or America Alone, a look at isolationism. Before we get started, the University of Colorado Boulder, Colorado's flagship university, honors and recognizes that many contributions of indigenous peoples in our state. CU Boulder acknowledges that it is located on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, and many other Native American nations. Their forced removal from these territories has caused devastating and lasting impacts. While the University of Colorado Boulder can never undo or rectify the devastation wrought on indigenous peoples, we commit to improving and enhancing engagement with indigenous peoples and issues locally and globally. We will do this by recognizing and amplifying the voices of indigenous CU Boulder students, staff, and faculty and their work, educating, conducting research, supporting student success, and integrating indigenous knowledge, consulting, engaging, and working collaboratively with tribal nations to enhance our ability to provide access and culturally sensitive support, and to recruit, retain, and graduate Native American students in a climate that is inclusive and respectful. One other thing I'd like to mention is that we want to be sure you get a chance to ask questions. Here's how we'll handle the Q&A. We'll reserve the end of the discussion for that Q&A. We're using a note card system to receive questions from the audience. At any time in the session, simply raise your hand to request a note card and pencil from one of our producers. Please write legibly. If you are a student, please note this on your question on the card. When you finish, raise your hand and hand it to the producer, who will bring it up to me. I urge everyone to please make your questions brief and to the point. And now I'd like to do a brief introduction of each panelist. So first we have Ambassador Eric Rubin. He retired from the U.S. Foreign Service in 2023 after a 38 career at the highest levels of the State Department, including service as U.S. Ambassador to Bulgaria, Deputy Chief of Mission in Moscow, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Europe and Eurasia, and Consul General in Chiang Mai. He taught at Georgetown School of Foreign Service as Dean and Virginia Rusk Fellow, and served as President of the American Foreign Service Association from 2019 to 2023. Rubin is a Senior Fellow at the RAND Corporation and the Center for European Policy Analysis, sits on the board of YIVO, and is active on the American Academy of Diplomacy, the Washington Institute of Foreign Affairs, and DACOR. He is a graduate of Yale University and spent part of his career on President Clinton's White House staff. Next, we have Patrick Deneen, who holds a BA in English Literature and a PhD in Political Science from Rutgers University. He was a speechwriter and special advisor to the Director of the United States Information Agency. From 1997 to 2005, he was Assistant Professor of Government at Princeton University. From 2005 to 2012, he was an Associate Professor of Government at Georgetown University before joining the faculty of Notre Dame in fall 2012. He is the author and editor of several books and numerous articles and reviews, and has delivered and invited lectures around the world. His widely discussed 2018 book, Why Liberalism Failed, has been translated into over 20 languages and was praised by former President Barack Obama. Next, we have Heather Hurlburt, who is an Associate Fellow at Chatham House, focusing on bridging the gap between U.S. politics and international affairs. From 2022 to 2024, she served as Chief of Staff to U.S. Trade Representative Catherine Tai. Previously, she led the New Models of Policy Change project at New America, examining how international policy intersects with American political polarization. Hurlburt has held senior roles at the International Crisis Group and Human Rights First, served as a speechwriter for President Bill Clinton, along with Secretaries of State Madeleine Albright and Warren Christopher, and co-founded the Leadership Council for Women in National Security. She also serves on the U.S. Secretary of State's International Security Advisory Board and holds degrees from Brown and George Washington universities. And finally, we have Matija Goljar. He's an entrepreneur and educator who started his first tech company as a college freshman and later founded one of the largest entrepreneurship education programs in Eastern Europe. He gained nationwide recognition in Slovenia for creating and hosting the reality TV show Started Up Slovenia, which followed young founders launching their products in a major supermarket chain. Goljar is a sought-after consultant, mentor, and speaker, and he also works with the venture capital fund Silicon Gardens and is a visiting lecturer at numerous universities. He recently earned a Master of Arts in Applied Imagination from Central St. Martin's and now divides his time between consulting, teaching, and traveling the world in a tiny camper van. Great.
You really love making us blush, huh?
Well, we are honored to be joined by so many amazing panelists. And here at CWA, we really pride ourselves in making all of our panels really accessible to everyone from varying different levels of prior knowledge. So I'm going to kick it off with a very broad and perhaps basic question. How would you define isolationism and an isolationist approach to foreign policy? What sort of factors does the term include, political, economic, social, or otherwise? And would you describe the current political moment as a turn towards isolationism as you conceive it? And I think we'll start with Ambassador Rubin and just go down the line.
Thank you very much.
This was not planned.
There we go. Okay.
No.
Usually they turn it on from the back and you don't have to do anything.
Some technical difficulties, bear with us.
Can we borrow your mic, actually?
Of course. Let's just pass it down.
No, this one. This is the only one that's on.
Well, I guess they like me more than you guys.
Thank you. Now that'll work. I think it's a collaborative effort. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with you all, and thank you for coming. This is a really important topic, and I just wanted to say a few words about the historical context and what I think are the aspects that we should be focusing on as we discuss this topic today. Most of us have been through the classic American historical education approach to this topic, and the approach is that we had a very isolationist approach to our history before the First World War. Woodrow Wilson came in and pushed for an internationalist approach, including the Versailles Treaty and the League of Nations, which failed in the US Senate. We then went into a fairly isolationist period in the 20s and 30s, and the general historical consensus was that did not end well, and it was FDR who brought us back into an active international role with the Second World War. I think that history is real, but I think we don't want to get stuck there. I think we have to look at what happened since the Second World War, and I think most of the stereotypes and cliches are true. We basically made a decision after the Second World War that we needed to shape and run the world order after the disaster of the Second World War, more than 50 million dead, the Second World War in 1 century. And we did that, and we created the international order, we created the structures and the agencies and the fundamental institutions of the world order after World War II. And the important point I would make as we head into this discussion on isolationism and where we are now is this was not particularly altruistic. There maybe was a little bit of altruism, and there's nothing wrong with altruism, but fundamentally, our national security consensus after the Second World War was that we would benefit from a world order that was based on our principles and our concerns and our needs. And fundamentally, we did. And that world order is the foundation for the American prosperity that followed beginning in the 1950s, of the American-dominated world order, which continued until the end of the Cold War and thereafter. And it was overall, I would say, despite some very negative chapters, some very ugly chapters, certainly some very significant mistakes made, and one of them has to be said, were the wars in Southeast Asia, the Vietnam War, our intervention in Southeast Asia. I certainly hope we can agree that that was a mistake. And there were others, but at the same time, our fundamental national security and prosperity was based on that world order that we helped create, and part of it presumed American leadership, presumed that we would be in a leading role. And what we're now facing is really some fundamental questions post-Cold War, 30 years after the end of the Cold War. And I would argue, and we can get into more of this later, I don't want to go on for too long, but we made some very serious mistakes after the end of the Cold War, including assuming that everything would go our way without our even having to try, and that there was only one system in the world that worked, and that was ours, and everybody in the world was going to follow it. That hasn't turned out too well. But we're facing a real question now, which is, can we be prosperous and secure if we're not, at the very least, helping to lead the world order? Maybe not continuing to be the sole leader in the world order. And are there other countries that actually seek to replace the role that we've played since 1945? I would argue not, but we can get into that more in questions and other things. So I think those are the fundamental questions we're facing. And saying that America needs to play a critical role in leading the world does not mean that the United States has always done well by the world or even itself. It does not mean we haven't made mistakes. But I would argue it does mean that if we retreat from that leadership role, it's going to hurt us and it's going to hurt the rest of the world. I'll stop there. How about this one? This one's good.
Let's keep it. All right. Once again, for those of you who haven't left the room, I'm here to serve as the, and now for something completely different, role on this panel. The word isolationism is the label that was used by those who were opposed to staying out of World War I and World War II. In other words, it's meant as a derogatory label to describe those people who are inclined to stick their head in the sand and try not to pay attention to the world. The label that preceded the label isolationism, or the description, was to be a republic. If you are a republic, you are not an empire. This is the classical understanding of one's disposition toward the world. You are either a republic, in the Roman Republican sense of being a republic, a self-governing, relatively autonomous entity, relatively, not completely, but relatively autonomous political entity that seeks through its own self-governance, which is both political, economic, and otherwise, to remain relatively free of entanglements with other nations. And then there's the other end of the spectrum, which is to aspire to be an empire, which involves you deeply and profoundly in the affairs of other nations, but most of all involves you in wars with other nations. Who will dominate and who will be dominated? And the great debate in the history of political philosophy, which is what I studied, of course, political history, is it possible to be a republic? Or are you simply subject to the forces, the powers that exist elsewhere in the world? Are you simply either an empire or the subject of an empire? And many of the sort of sad answers to that question tends to be, you are either an empire or a subject nation. In 1776 and then 1789, this nation was founded on the idea that this was the first possible opportunity for a modern nation to become a republic because it was relatively isolated or relatively protected by two oceans. Of course, it shared borders with other nations, but was it possible? This was the great experiment. Was it possible to establish a nation that could be a republic and avoid either the fate of being an empire or being subject to an empire? That was the basis on which this nation was founded, and those who defended America as a nation that would remain relatively unentangled with foreign nations believed that they were defending this idea and ideal of republic. They never called themselves isolationists. Who was the first great articulator of this? George Washington. Read his farewell address. A very powerful statement that if we want to retain our freedom, if we want to retain our ability to govern ourselves, we have to remain relatively free of entanglements with other nations, particularly the nations of Europe. Now, we can debate whether this was a good idea or a bad idea. Has modernity fundamentally changed this? But by calling this position or relabeling this position as isolationist, notice what changed. It's no longer a deep and profound question about the nature of our political society. It's, are you somebody who denies reality or somebody who engages with reality? And if you're a realist, if you're someone who's really smart and intelligent, then you're not an isolationist. I think this is a sleight of hand, and one that personally I think should be pushed against as a kind of trick of history. And it seems to me at this moment we are confronting very much the limits of what it is to be or to have experienced this time of being an empire, the costs of being an empire, and maybe contrary to the ambassador, the costs of being engaged in constant wars since the end of World War II when we assumed the position of being an empire. It wasn't just that one or two mistakes were made. We have been at war almost without pause since the end of World War II. And the cost of those wars isn't just the numbers of our fellow citizens who have died or the expenditure of our wealth for these wars. It lies at the heart of the divisions, the political divisions that are racking our country right now. This is exactly what Washington was warning against. It wasn't necessarily the foreign policy costs of being an empire. It's what it would do to us domestically and the kind of divisions that it would create domestically. So I think this is a really ripe time not only to reassess America's role in the world, but to reassess the labels that we use to describe our role in the world.
No, it's all good. Thank you. Nope.
Test my gate.
There we go. That was dramatic. So I'm going to mix things up here, and I will say one of the really fun things about this topic at this time is that it doesn't break down neatly along partisan lines, and so I'm going to agree with some things that Patrick said and some things that Eric said. And the first thing, though, where I resoundingly agree with Patrick is that for at least the last 20 years and maybe more like the last 50 years, the only really useful way of understanding the term isolationism is as an insult that you use to try to discredit somebody else's position on issues. And I think it's really not, it's not a useful analytic term. And I think one can, however, draw, and you've both started to do this in some ways, some important periodizations around moments where the U.S., for much of its history, as Patrick said, saw it as actively unuseful to be too deeply engaged in the rest of the world, although that didn't stop us from promulgating the Monroe Doctrine and telling the rest of the world that whatever you want to call what we were doing in Latin America, only we were allowed to do it. And then you have the post-World War II period, which I think has been discussed in some detail. But so the other thing that is tricky about isolationism and its use in the contemporary moment that I think can be particularly bedeviling for liberals, so I'm going to just speak to my fellow liberals in the room for a minute, is there is this reflexive temptation to say that lots of our Republican colleagues are isolationist. And so I'll throw out a kind of a fun example. So when Stephen Miller goes to the Senate and says the purpose of the tariffs is to create autarky, right? And to make the US totally economically independent from the rest of the world. That sounds like isolationism, right? You kind of vaguely have the idea in your head, okay, if there is isolationism, that would be what it is. But then you look and there are other parts of his ideology, and now he's one figure, so I'm not implicating anybody but him here. There are other parts of his ideology where he says we want to work with other national conservative movements in government around the world. And so you think to yourself, that sounds kind of like internationalism, just not my kind of internationalism. So now how do I think about that? Is that isolationist because it rejects the rules-based international order? Or is that profoundly internationalist because it says we want to make common cause with other governments and movements that share our core values? And of course, making common cause with other governments and movements that share core values was a profound piece of the post-World War II order that Eric talked about. So, it turns out that one person's isolationism is another person's internationalism. So I think that it's important that we recognize that the constructs are really slippery. So, having dispensed with the title of the panel, I'll take another minute or two to talk about where I see us in the current moment and to introduce, I think, a complicating factor maybe between the things that Eric and Patrick said, because the really unique aspect of Pax Americana in the post-World War II years was that although we often failed and were often self-deluding, there were aspects of it that were not only profoundly anti-empire and anti-colonial, but that contained within them actually the tools and the seeds which you could use to challenge empires and colonies, both other countries' empires and colonies and our own pseudo-empire practices. And that, although again, partial, incomplete, hypocritical, all the critiques you want to make, that was profoundly different from other empires that we have seen during history. And that may go some distance toward explaining why Pax Americana lasted as long as it did. However, that also did very little that you could easily, in a concrete way, show Americans how it was improving their daily lives. And the Trump administration and some of the currents that I think this panel was originally created to address, which Vara, we are very uncooperatively not addressing, grows out of, I think, the recognition of Trump and the people around him that this feeling about war that Patrick referenced was much deeper in the population or in some parts of the population than shows up in public opinion surveys. And the feeling that our economic discontents, our economic inequality, and the stagnation of some of our communities, particularly old manufacturing communities, could be traced to the growth of globalization and our economic connectivity overseas. We can spend the rest of this panel or another panel arguing about the extent to which that is or isn't true, but there's no doubt it's a story that has profoundly taken hold in the American psyche. Now, at the same time, we went from being 40% of the global economy to 22% of the global economy. We went from being, we're a much smaller percent of the world's population than we used to be. There are many more governments, many more manufacturing powerhouses than there were when the existing international system was set up. So you can be profoundly internationalist, profoundly humanitarian, and still look at the existing international system and say, maybe this doesn't serve us, and maybe this doesn't serve the people we say we want to help either. And it's our failings on a bipartisan level as a society to figure out how to get to grips with that sooner that left the opening for the profoundly anti-institutional, anti-globalization, anti-rules of the road system to come in and sweep away, if what you really care about is war, your first target wouldn't have been USAID, in my humble opinion. But we left the opening in a bipartisan, cross-society way that allowed this thing, which I don't want to call isolationism, but which is nonetheless a real thing, to emerge.
Mic check. Good. Okay. first things first, I have a huge imposter syndrome here. I mean, obviously these guys are experts in the field and I'm not, but on a more personal note, what they paid for college tuition is about as much as 1 year of education to cover the whole university system in Slovenia is. Just, to start things off. And not to be critical of this country. In fact, let me go in a completely different direction. I first came to Boulder in 2014 as a young student with big eyes. We started a non-profit in Slovenia to teach high school students how to earn a living by doing what they love. Basically, we took a post-socialist society and started teaching them capitalism. Start a business, do a company, everything that, we here love. And it was the American embassy who was the first ones who gave us like the first couple thousand so that we could start. And then that kind of progressed to me being invited to this university for an accelerator program where, for a young kid from Eastern Europe, the eyes lit up. For the first time I saw recognition, what we're doing is right. For the first time there were people around me to say, what you're doing is good and you should keep going. I think that's the immigrant story. I think that's the American story. I think that's a little bit the story that every young, naive person in the darkest and weirdest places of the world has about America. But you know what comes next in this sentence, right? Not anymore. Why? Well, I liked what the honorable predecessor before me said. Of course, he served in our part of the world and understands full well that it's not good to talk about internal politics of another country, so I'm not going to do that here. But, to go straight to the point with the inconvenient truth, I just opened BBC and it says, Trump praises explosive tariffs hours before imposing 104% rate on China, 22 minutes ago. Good job, guys. Good job. As a European, what can I say? USAID, of course. I mean, we don't need to be stupid to understand this, right? Everyone in this room knows it, but nobody speaks at it directly. I am a deep fan of republicanism and the idea of a republic. But I think this country has gone full circle from George III to Donald I. Because Republicans, guys, if you call this a Republican Party, I think this is feudalism, I think this is monarchy. And I am never going to claim that I am any expert in international policy, trade, tariffs, all that stuff. I'm a humble entrepreneur who started a small company, right? And there's so many other people around me who do the same, who just want to be left alone to do our own thing, do it in peace. My country is the Shire compared to the Mordor and Gondor fighting and all this thing. But here's what I'll tell you. For a long, long time, we were seeing America with all the hopes and the expectations, and it's so much better to deal with you guys than with Russia, than with China, than with the Saudi money. But when USAID goes away, where America turns a little bit weird, maybe some other less scrupulous country is going to say, hey, but we can pay for your highway. Hey, but we can pay for your entrepreneurship program. Hey, all the incubators for business in the Balkans stopped because USAID was paying. Who came? China came. Confucius Institute is happy to pay and will continue paying, right? That's the reality here. And I love you guys. I mean, obviously, there are big words and philosophies about it. I don't understand them enough. But I can tell you this. The consequences of what's happening right now are not going to be economic, but they're going to be personal, because people will remember the schoolyard bully. They will forget what precisely he did. But we know what it felt when we were humiliated, when we're being bullied, where people are telling us, you guys are shit, and using all the bad words that you would never use in front of your mother. America was better than this, please. Oh, and just to say this, did you notice she used past tense in Pax Americana?
Well, I think this is a good transition to a question I have for Ambassador Rubin. How do you think, in a nod to our title, how do you think an America First rhetoric will shape relations with U.S. allies and partners, and do you foresee challenges in maintaining trust and cooperation? And as a follow-up to that, have you witnessed anything like this in your career, or is the current administration's approach to foreign policy somewhat unprecedented?
That's a lot to unpack there, but I'll try. I think it's important to note that when Pax Americana, as it has been described, was started, we were the only game in town. And we did play the major role in rebuilding Europe and, frankly, much of the rest of the world. And we were, I think, the leading model for so much of the world. It was not always a pretty picture, and we played a little dirty. And if you look at the history of the democratic elections in Europe in the post-World War II period, including in the 1940s and 1950s, the CIA did intervene in democratic elections, and we did put money into ensuring that people who agreed with us won. So I don't mean to paint a totally happy picture, but nonetheless, our model was the model. There were really no good competing models. Stalinist communism was not a good competing model. And I think if you carry that forward and then ask the question you're asking about right now, there are a couple of things. The American people need to understand that we still have a lot of strengths and we still have a lot of, I would say, areas where we are dominant still. One of them obviously is military power, although that's shifting rather rapidly and is no longer what it was. Economically still, we remain the largest economy, but that's a little shaky too, and we'll see where that goes. But more importantly, I think this idea that we have a unique approach that everyone needs to follow is something that no longer really works or is accepted around the world. So I think that's number one. Number two, I think, is the need to recognize that we can't just direct the rest of the world to follow our lead anymore. And we did a lot of that during the Cold War and after, and we still do it. And to some extent, countries are still deciding, is it worth putting up with America's basically tendency toward domination and ordering us about and telling us what to do because we get things we need from the United States. And that's a debate that's going on right now all over the world. And, you know, we are still very useful to much of the world, and most of the world does not want to alienate us or lose us as allies and partners. So that is real. At the same time, you know, bullying, you know, Matija mentioned this, bullying is not going to work, and it's not an effective approach. It probably never was. But when we controlled the world economy and established all the world's institutions, we got away with a lot more of it than we can now. So I think the need to convince, the need to persuade, the need to model behavior, I think if we want the world to support us is going to be more and more important. And the truth is, we also need to do better, and I say this as someone who retired a year and a half ago, so I can say what I think after 38 years. We need to be a better model if we want the world to follow our lead. And we can preach democracy, we can preach anti-corruption, we can preach all this, but you know, the rest of the world is looking at us and saying, you know, is the United States a model we want to follow? So I think that has to be a factor as well. And you know, I think the American people, unfortunately, are a little insulated from some of these debates, but I think they need to understand them a little better. I'll stop there.
Great. So my next question is going to be to you, Heather. Do you see signs that polarization at home is pushing the country towards isolationism abroad, or do you think that polarization has little effect on policy decisions?
So this is a wild thing that has happened in the US, actually in the years since I first came to CWA. It used to be, even as polarization swept across many other pieces of our national life, that national security was the one space where Democrats and Republicans could come together. And in some ways, that was profoundly positive. In other ways, I have to say, at this point, looking back, there were some real negatives to that, because there's a whole set of things that Republicans and Democrats would say, well, we can't agree on anything else, but we can agree on the military. So for example, the military has a huge, or had, to your point again, a huge breast cancer research program. Now, there are lots of folks in the military and military dependents who need the very best breast cancer care, but so do the rest of us. Why is that sitting there? It's sitting there because that's where you could agree to put the money. Now, in terms of efficient administration of a government, that's ridiculous. But that was a feature of polarization where the one thing Democrats and Republicans could agree on was that we loved the troops and we loved the military. Over the last 10 years, though, that actually has ended, and now on many, many foreign policy issues, we are just as polarized, if not more polarized. One of the things I'll be watching over the next few weeks is whether the extremeness of the reactions to the tariff policy actually changed this, but up to last Wednesday. Your views on international economics almost entirely dependent on who you voted for president. Russia policy is another fascinating example where before President Trump took up his current set of positions on Russia, used to be the case that Democrats were much less hawkish toward Russia and Republicans were much more hawkish. And when President Trump took the set of views that he now espouses and started to be very public about them, complete flip overnight. So actually, our foreign policy has been just completely consumed by our polarization, and this has meant that, I mean, frankly, in an interesting way, it's meant that no administration in recent history has been able to really do good and hard what it wanted to do, which may be good, may be bad in some circumstances. Judge for yourself.
Great. So this is going to be to anyone that would like to answer it.
Could you please talk into your microphone?
Sure. Sorry about that. This is to whomever would like to answer. But our current administration does not seem to be so much isolationist or supportive of being a republic as being selectively imperialist. For example, Greenland, Canada, and etc. How is this different than the foreign policies of previous administrations?
Well, I can't comment about the second part because they're the expert, but yeah, I mean, of course, selective, Israel, Greenland, you name it. But that's been the case for the whole time, right? We've always felt, speaking from somebody who's from Europe, that we're, living the waves of whatever the superpower does, and that's normal. To some extent, we also understand that the internal politics are going to influence whatever's happening externally, and that, again, is something that is completely acceptable, and every country does it to an extent. What we're seeing here, though, I think, is a couple of steps above, where for some reason, somehow, what ended up happening in this part of the world was that it's more important to win, get a tribe, and be a leader than to actually, I don't know, govern, do good, take care about the next day, or whatever that means. Now, again, internal policy of USA is your thing. What we're seeing right now is that when Mr. Donald the Great is doing his next crazy thing, there's going to be a little dictator in our part of the world, or that Tajikistan, or that wherever the hell it is, place, trying to do the same. And that's where we have a problem. Because the real challenge here is that even though you can lose the midterm election, another Congress comes in and changes everything, and everything kind of goes back to normal. We still need to live with the populist guys who are empowered and emboldened because America the Great thinks this is okay. And I know that us intellectuals in this room probably understand that, it was a fluke of history. But the average plebeian person who doesn't really know much and doesn't really understand much or travel a lot, well, these consequences can stay. And that's something that we should be deeply aware of. And that's why I think everyone here in this country is underestimating the gravity of what's happening here.
If I may. no matter what one thinks about decisions of the current administration, this administration was voted by a majority of American citizens.
And that might be a little bit
majority
of a
American
problem,
citizens.
right?
It was voted by
voters.
a majority, excuse me,
All right.
a majority of voters, half of your fellow countrymen.
We're going to ask the audience to
Guys,
stop
please let him
talking.
finish.
Yeah, let him speak, please.
I'm going to walk off the stage.
Yes, please, no more, nothing more from the audience. Thank you. You can, if you have questions, you can ask them on a note card.
What I am attempting to say is that half of our fellow citizens were so desperate about their situation and condition that they thought this figure that you're describing in very unflattering terms was their best option. As an American citizen, I find this to be something that I have to give deep consideration and thought, not simply dismiss as uneducated rubes who didn't know any better, as people I can dismiss as undeserving of my esteem. So let's begin to attempt to understand what was their thinking. And to go back to various aspects that I was describing, who has borne far greater burden in the eternal wars that America has been fighting under the so-called Pax Americana? It's not the people in this room, or at least I'm guessing it's not the people in this room. It used to be the case that students who studied at the universities where I taught, including Georgetown, including Princeton, and including Notre Dame, used to be on the front lines. Almost no students that I teach at elite universities are serving in the Army. They're not experiencing, or serving in the military, they're not experiencing the actual, what the Pax Americana requires. At the same time, this Pax Americana came at the cost of removing from all of our lives the capacity to be self-governing, the capacity to feel that we exercise our citizenship in our communities, because so much of the money and the influence of the power flowed up to Washington, D.C. The 10 most wealthy counties in the country are not around Denver, Colorado. They're around Washington, D.C. And why is that? What is D.C. producing of great value? It's producing power, and it's distributing wealth. While, as was described, we have stagnation in other parts of our country. So we have felt, many of our fellow citizens have felt a loss and a kind of despair over their capacity to be self-governing citizens, over their economic fates, seeing their children in worse conditions than they are. So whatever we say about this man, it is a result of a whole series of policies, and we debate whether or not this policy had this effect, but that has not served half of our fellow citizens well, and who were despairing enough that they viewed someone who came and said, I will break the system, as their best option. And that's all I would simply submit, is that the costs of the Pax Americana on our own country and our domestic politics have been so high that this is a time of reconsideration.
Sure, if you'd like to respond, absolutely.
And let me just say this. I may be the muckraker here on this panel, but I want to defend Professor Danin here for one very important reason. Donald the Great, or however I might call him, because I like to, just because he's married to a Slovenian lady who we are very unproud of. No, but here's my real point. He is the symptom of a much deeper problem. And the issue here, yeah, that's okay, but the issue here is not just to say, ooh, this is all bad, everything's gonna go to shit. What we need to do is to bring back something that was completely normal 20, 30, 40 years ago, which was a debate. I still remember waking up at 3 in the morning to listen to the debate between Biden and Trump, you know, the weird one, right? When the whole world was watching, like, what are these two old dudes shouting at each other? This is not an argumented discussion. This is something from a kindergarten, right? Both of them. And here's my real issue here. When it happens, the education system collapses, where the societal system is cracking, where people don't have enough to live by, obviously, people are gonna turn primal, and it's going to be much more easy to have, you know, a caveman discussion instead of an intellectual debate. If we are to think about the future and it's going to be better tomorrow, step one is to allow this debate to happen. And I'm going to be super transparent. There's many things I don't agree with him, but we should debate about it instead of, shouting over each other. And that's all. And now we can go on with the questions.
Thanks. So we have a lot of questions coming. I'm going to combine a couple. So this one's from a student. A major criticism of the United States is that it has been too involved in other countries. The U.S. has been called the world police. And in that vein, is there a healthy level of entanglement with other countries? Can we still balance representing or respecting country sovereignty with not being too isolationist? To whomever would like to respond.
All right, maybe I'll take a first try at that. This is what we're discussing right now, and I think it is the fundamental core of the discussion. I fervently believe that the world is too complicated and too interrelated for us to retreat and to assume that withdrawing from engagement in the world is going to be in our interest. That doesn't mean that all intervention, all engagement is a good idea. I have never once in my life supported the invasion of Iraq. I thought it was a horrible mistake when it happened. I do wish to note that it was done by Republicans. And I am serious about that because when we talk about this question, which I think Patrick is very right about in many respects, this is not a political issue in terms of who's in favor of gross intervention in the world and who's in favor of not doing that. It has crossed party lines. It's been a bipartisan, nonpartisan problem in many respects. But for example, one can believe that we need to adjust the World Trade System so that we have fewer job losses in the United States and other industrial countries, without saying that global trade is a problem and we shouldn't have any, which is an autarkic concept that just isn't going to work. At the same time, if you look at the history of our engagement, long before World War II, the idea that we had something to share with the rest of the world, I think, is very positive and something I believe in. That doesn't mean that every time we've decided to intervene, it's been from good motives or has been successful. So, I think the first thing to say is we can't find just a simplistic solution to this and say either the U.S. withdraws from leadership in the world, which I think will always end badly, or that everything we're doing and we have done is okay, because that's not the case at all. But I do think fundamentally, and this goes back to the beginning of our discussion, we can't survive and prosper and thrive without partners and allies and friends, and nor can anybody else in the world. There's no possibility of successful autarky. So we need to recognize how much our alliances have done for us, how much our trading relationships have done for us. Anybody who thinks that our imbalanced trade relationship with China, and it certainly has been imbalanced for several decades, but anybody who thinks it's just been in China's interest, you really need to take another look and look at how much that has benefited the United States private sector and our big companies. It doesn't mean it's benefited American workers. That's the kind of thing we have to look at very candidly. And the last thing I'll say is, without a system of laws and rules such as was established by the United Nations, which we were the major force in creating, and all the other international institutions, and that's why what's going on right now in Ukraine is so critical. If the world becomes lawless, we will suffer. We will pay the price along with everybody else. So that doesn't mean we get to set all the rules. We have to negotiate with the rest of the world, but we do have to insist that the world is a cooperative engagement process that we have to be part of. Thanks.
Couple No?
No.
There we go. Thanks. Couple quick points to add on this. First, just to note that actually the post-World War II and post-Cold War periods were enormously good and enormously enriching for the United States as a whole. And anyone from the Global South listening to this conversation would think it was absolutely nuts that we were sitting here saying that that period wasn't good for us. So what we failed to do internally was figure out how to redistribute the benefits and the costs fairly across our society. And you can look at other countries, actually other countries that were much more fully enmeshed in the global system than ours. I mean, to your point, Matija, smaller countries that didn't have any choice whatsoever in the matter, who figured out how to redistribute better and who are facing a more manageable level of the kind of social discontents that Patrick talked about. So that's point number one. Point number two is that I think this has been recognized. Those of you who remember President Obama's first campaign, one of the things he wanted to talk to the American people about was edging away from this kind of overextended empire, U.S. as global policeman, U.S. does all the work. And I think a thing he found, and his team found both at home and abroad, is that both our system of government and politics and other countries' systems of government and politics are built around the idea that we are, Eric, as you said, the world's leader. And so other countries, you don't have a lot of incentive to step into a space that usually the US will occupy if you bug them long enough. And we, frankly, in democratic administrations, made very slow and edgy progress on that. And it was ripe to be disrupted in the way that President Trump disrupted it. The last thing I will say is that the point about who serves in the US Armed Forces had historically been a very real one. However, in an administration that is systematically kicking out women and trans people who braved their lives for us and who has senior officials who actively talk about making the military whiter, I am no longer willing to be lectured about unfair sacrifices of certain segments of the US population.
So I have one that I'm going to turn to you, Patrick. Do you see the rise of an American first approach and/or isolationist tendencies as a natural outcome of internal divisions within the U.S.? And if so, does that suggest a rethinking of liberal internationalism or an outright rejection of the principles that shaped post-war American foreign policy?
Yeah, well, I think the question contains the answer that I've already already offered. It's maybe an unfortunate fact of our political existence that we tend to have a kind of division of labor. The people who work on international or foreign relations, often people working in the foreign, in the foreign policy world, and then people who work in domestic politics. And of course, these two things, and I think that's one of the things that's becoming quite clear in the conversation on this panel, these two aspects are deeply interwoven. And they're interwoven in ways that often escape our immediate capacity to understand the ways that they're interwoven. One aspect that I would emphasize is that it's something that actually that Heather mentioned earlier, which is there was a kind of slow recognition of the levels of discontent that were percolating up in the country. And it's striking that you point to the fact that it was a Republican administration that precipitated and organized and advanced the war in Iraq, and altogether unrecognized in the Republican political world was the fact that the rank and file voters in the Republican Party disliked certainly the consequences of the war in Iraq. And when Donald Trump in the first debate in 2015 or 2016 raised a criticism of George W. Bush's policy in front of Jeb in the state of South Carolina, where a large number of people serve in the armed forces, or a large percentage in the armed forces come from, everyone thought that was the end of his campaign. Right? How could a Republican candidate get up and criticize the war in Iraq and George W. Bush? And it turned out that was immensely popular among the rank and file. And this is one area where our domestic politics, in some ways you could say, play into the complexities now of the international situation that we're playing. And I'm gonna make one particular, maybe personal note. I was put on this panel at the very, very last minute. This panel was supposed to be these three people and this interlocutor. And I think somebody realized, oh my gosh, like three people who kind of agree with each other, and maybe we should have somebody else.
We don't agree, believe me.
Maybe we should have somebody else. Now that's a kind of nod to a slightly changed, or recognition of a slightly changed world. A year ago, I wouldn't be here, I dare say. But now, well, maybe we should hear from somebody from the other side. In other words, the liberal institutions, the bipartisan agreement in foreign policy that's been discussed, was a feature of our domestic situation, which was a hardened, you could say, institutional form that resisted the presence of alternative voices. This is true in the academy, this is true in journalism, this was true in the institutions, the NGOs, this is true in the bureaucracy. Every institution in American life was more or less hardened against what was percolating up from the bottom. And so now if we find ourselves in this situation, okay, maybe we're going to overshoot the correction, which I think is very likely. That's in significant part because this slowness in hearing this discontent was part of our domestic set of organizations, and our domestic, the way in which we'd organize many of our institutions. So I would say that my word of the day that I would leave you with is humility. I think in approaching, I'm hearing this as well from the ambassadors, is that we need an awful lot more humility in how we think about these debates, our certainty in these debates, but also our relationship to other nations. One of the things that alarms me a lot about the modern American way of life is that even in the foreign policy world, it has become of decreasing importance that we learn foreign languages. Foreign language requirements have almost ceased to exist at universities. Universities are eliminating foreign language departments. This is just one sign of the way in which we lack humility because we don't think we have to learn the languages of other people and other nations. And I would dare say that even in the foreign service, there are a lot fewer people today than maybe 20 or 30 years ago who know foreign languages. Well, it may not be true, but it was certainly true at Georgetown when I was teaching there, that a lot fewer students were learning foreign languages. So I simply think that as a nation, we need to learn a lot more humility in our relationship to other nations, and also humility in how we, as members of the elite, understand those who are not in this room.
Vara, please stop me when I speak too much, because I know I'm going into a direction here, but I feel I need to respond. What you said was right. There are structural issues that people are upset, and because people are upset, they tend to vote in a specific way that might not be constructive. Absolutely. But what I'm hearing from you American friends at this panel is like, it's Democrat this, Republican that. I mean, guys, do you see that sign on the door? It says hide, run, and what? Fight. Never in the world does this exist. We see a situation where people are poor, where people don't know how to live the next day, where people don't have healthcare, where people don't have education. Of course they're gonna vote populist, of course there's gonna be problems. Can't you agree precisely on that one thing? I don't know how, I don't know in which direction, but apparently every other developed country in the world has figured that out, and we do not have this particular problem. I would like to say simply this: humility is not the right word here. Even though I agree we should all be more humble, probably myself included. Definitely myself included, actually. My wife's smiling. But the serious point, and I'm gonna stop with this, is actually very simple for me. One major problem that destroys every society, whether it's Germany, whether it's Hungary, whether it's gonna be Venezuela or the United States of America, when we come to a situation where a populist who is only focusing on winning the election and not caring about anything else, when that person gets in charge, bad things happen. One thing, simple thing that we should all prevent, Democrats, Republicans alike, you do not want a feudal lord as your boss because you don't know what's going to happen next. It's really that simple. And historically, in my part of the world, we still remember all the people who died and all the families that were destroyed because of that one thing. And if humbly I can say one thing to you guys, the situation is much, much worse than you think. And also much, much worse than all the experts here are willing to talk about or able to talk about, and I don't know which one of this is more problematic. So let me end with one suggestion of hope so that we are not just going to be America bashing and pessimistic. Let's return to the Roman Empire, because I think history can teach us a lot. Cato the Elder, the famous story that everyone in political science remembers, right? Carthage must be destroyed. For 2 years, Cato the Elder would finish every speech in the forum of Rome. Delenda est Carthago. Talking about whatever. His last sentence, Delenda est Carthago. Delenda est MAGA. Delenda est fascism. You should be able and willing that every single time you have a debate, if you're a liberal, if you're a true Republican and not a monarch, to say this, I am willing to have all the debates on the planet. I am willing to hear any opinion except fascism. Except that, because that's a third rail that is going to kill you at some point for sure. History knows that. You guys should too. Thank you very much.
So I'm very sorry to say we only have about 9 minutes left, and I have some really great questions that I'd like to get to. So I'm going to have to ask you to be a bit brief in your responses, which makes me very sad because this is a lot of fun. Okay, so this is to whomever would like to answer it again. After thousands of years of turmoil, Europe fought 2 horrible wars in the 20th century. If America, which has helped to maintain order after 1948, withdraws from Europe, and the continent arms itself, can the old tribal rivalries resurface into wars again?
Eric, you want that one?
I don't know if I want it, but this microphone will work. Thank you. I think we should not overestimate the negative aspects of what's going on in Europe right now, even though there are quite a number of negative aspects, but there are some positive ones too. Fundamentally, the argument that Europe has not done enough for its own defense is correct. It's not entirely correct, and some of the people who've argued that the Europeans have just been free riders and have not contributed, to some extent, that's actually not true, and if you look at the numbers and you look at the contributions, but the big picture is correct, and that is starting to change, and I actually think maybe the circumstances under which that's starting to change are not good. It's not the way I would like to see the U.S.-European relationship and the dialogue between ourselves and our European allies conduct, but there is a new seriousness. We're also seeing post-Brexit the United Kingdom drawing closer to the European Union. I think there's now a broad consensus in the UK that Brexit was probably the single worst decision in the history of any modern country, except maybe President Trump's tariffs, but I'll leave it at that. But there is a sense that there needs to be more unity and more togetherness. So, I think it's not all bad. At the same time, we made a decision. Again, I come back to the argument that this was not about altruism, even though there was a little bit of altruism involved, and we should be proud of that. But we basically took over in Europe after World War II because the Europeans had screwed it up so badly. And after 2 world wars with, approaching 100 million dead, we basically said, we can't trust you to run your own affairs. And, we've been drawn into 2 consecutive world wars at enormous cost. And so we're going to, come in with a fairly heavy hand and try to reorganize stuff. We don't need to play that role that way anymore, but at the same time, and it's what we're hearing from our European allies, it's not going to go well if we just walk away. And I am optimistic that we won't just walk away. This is a very delicate moment, and there's some crazy stuff going on, and there's some very scary stuff. But fundamentally, the other piece that remains to me fundamental is we need to be together with the societies in the world that share our basic values. And that is Europe and Japan and our other allies in Asia Pacific and across the globe, because that's fundamental. That's about civilization, how we want to live our lives. And I do believe at the end of the day that will prevail. But we're going to have to get through some very difficult periods right now. And I do think Ukraine obviously is going to be the focal point for the next year or two on how that plays out. But I would say I'm not as pessimistic as some about this. I think at the end of the day, the fundamentals will win out.
So I'm going to ask either Heather or Patrick or both to answer these set of questions, and also ask that you answer them in about 60 seconds. So, how can debates on international policy be most effectively conveyed to everyday people? Who should be responsible for conveying this information? And kind of related, how do we continue to push past divisions to address these national and international discontents in truly beneficial ways?
Can you say the second question again?
Yes. How can we continue to push past divisions to address these national and international discontents in truly beneficial ways?
Well, as I've already indicated, I think there's been, I've been teaching in higher education for over 30 years, and I've seen it, again, I mentioned my first position, Princeton, Georgetown, and now Notre Dame. I've seen it really shift from institutions that had a pretty wide array of perspectives within those institutions. So anyone who was educated at those institutions received a wide array of perspectives. And so they could, again, this would sort of, you want to call it trickle-down information or knowledge. The college-educated would convey this through their various roles in life to those maybe who weren't as close to these worldviews. So at the very least, you had the kind of, again, the educated, maybe the more informed people of our society exposed to a wide range of worldviews. Now, they would hold their own views. Everyone should hold their own views. But you would hold those views with other voices in your head. And what I've seen over the course of this 30 years is a homogenization of higher education, homogenization of those institutions that are in some senses responsible for forming and shaping the worldview of the people who will be leading our society in all walks of life. I'm here teaching this semester, actually this academic year at the University of Colorado, in this kind of sinecure representative position as the conservative chair or the chair of conservative thought at the University of Colorado. So some legislator can say, yeah, we have conservatives there. We got a guy here for 6 months. And so we covered our base. That's not really conveying genuine wide array of viewpoints to the students in this university. We're doing a disservice to these young people, not in some ways exposing them to and providing for them the array of worldviews. So I would say these two questions are in a way related. That if we want to overcome our divisions, we have to understand the actual nature of those divisions. We have to have people who are engaged in sometimes fraught conversations, but nevertheless conversations, without shouting them down, thank you, listening to those views, and then forming our own conclusions and perhaps changing our views slightly as a result of hearing those views. And that this has the effect of filtering down to everyday opinion. It's not that necessarily every person is going to be, reading the New York Times and listening to NPR. It'd be good for those to have a variety of views as well. But to, especially in our elite institutions, to open them again to these, to what it turns out have been a series of a whole range of concerns that now have suddenly, in the view of many of us, suddenly appeared out of nowhere, but in fact have been percolating there underground for a very long period of time, and we have more or less kind of, like Odysseus on the boat, put the wax in our ears to avoid hearing them. So I think these two things are fundamentally related, and Colorado might be a place that could begin to redress that.
So couple super quick suggestions. One, just to say I was very impressed with the range and sophistication of questions I got from the students in the Theories of War and Peace class yesterday. So I feel like someone's doing some good work here. They were questions that were hard for me to answer. There is a belief in our media ecosystem that, number one, quote unquote, nobody votes on foreign policy. I hope listening, if you take nothing away from what Patrick has had to say, I hope you take away the idea that maybe some people voted on some international issues. This has driven me crazy for decades because I think people vote on leadership, and security is part of leadership. So you can be part of trying to change that. Whenever you hear that cliche, you should shut it down. And also that people don't click on foreign news, that nobody wants. I mean, a reason that it's very difficult for non-specialists to access information is there's a perception that Americans don't care about it. So actually, you can choose to consume information and help change that landscape and open up more opportunities for more news to be produced, more people to know, think about it, have opinions, ask questions, and have debates. So those are a couple of just super pragmatic things you can do.
Thank you so much. I'm really sad to say that that brings us to the end of our time. I feel like it's kind of unfair due to our technical difficulties, but I really appreciate the discussion. It was really great, and thanks so much for being here.
Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs, and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.